On the morning of the 7th of December, 1941, 8 American battleships sit at anchor in Pearl Harbor. Within 2 hours, the fate of every one of them will change forever. Almost everyone knows how that morning ended. Almost nobody knows what happened to these ships afterward. Some of them never left the harbor and lie in it to this day. Others rose from the bottom and came back to take revenge on the men who sank them in the last battleship duel in history. One survived 2 atomic bombs and still refused to go down. Another vanished in the open ocean, and the place where it sank has never been found. By the end of this video, you will know exactly what happened to each of the 8, and to the men who stayed inside them.
You will learn why an entire ship's band died together in a single morning, how 3 sailors lived for 16 more days sealed inside a steel compartment, and why one American captain buried an enemy kamikaze pilot with full military honors under the flag of his own country. Before we go on, one question for you personally. Is there a connection in your family to that war at sea? Someone who served in the Navy? A relative who was at Pearl Harbor? Or someone who later fought in the Pacific? Tell us about them in the comments. On this channel, we tell these stories for exactly one reason, so that those names get said out loud. Now, let us start with the ship everyone knows, and with a band almost nobody talks about. To understand everything that came next, you first have to understand what these ships were. 8 battleships, the pride of the Pacific Fleet, moored in pairs along a stretch of water the sailors simply called Battleship Row.
Arizona lay on Battleship Row that Sunday morning. A bomb punched through her deck near the bow and detonated in the forward magazine. The blast was catastrophic. It lifted the multi-ton forward section into the air and broke the ship's back. Arizona went under in 9 minutes. 1,177 men died, more than on any other ship that day, more than half of everyone killed in the entire attack. Among them was the ship's whole band, to the last man. 21 musicians, United States Navy Band Unit 22, under Bandmaster Fred Kinney. The night before, they had played in a competition between the fleet's bands, the so-called Battle of Music, and the musicians from the other ships had voted unanimously to give them first place. The next morning, the band went to its battle stations. On a battleship, the musicians had a job in combat. They passed shells and powder charges up to turret number 2, the very turret under which the magazine exploded. All 21 died within minutes. Never before or since in American history has an entire military band been killed in action together. The Battle of Music trophy was later renamed permanently the USS Arizona Band Trophy and engraved with 21 names. And there was another cost aboard Arizona worth telling on its own. On ships like these, brothers often served together, whole families at once, and Arizona had an unusual number of them. 37 pairs and trios of brothers, 77 men in all. That morning, 23 sets of brothers died together on one ship. There was also the crew's only father and son pair aboard. Thomas Free, aged 50, and his son William, who was 17. Both were killed. Of all the brothers on Arizona, only one full pair truly survived, Kenneth and Russell Warrener, and only because one of them was not aboard that Sunday. He was away at flight school, thousands of miles from the harbor.
For many American families, that single bomb in the forward magazine erased 2 sons at once, sometimes 3. Arizona was never raised. The damage was too severe, and she was left exactly where she sank, together with the men still inside her. More than 80 years later, she still lies on the bottom of the harbor, and oil seeps from her tanks a drop at a time, rising to the surface in slow rainbow slicks. 7 to 9 quarts a day. They are called the black tears of Arizona, and Arizona still receives her own. Of the men who lived through that morning, around 40 have asked, over the decades, to be returned to their fallen shipmates after death. Divers lower an urn of ashes into the well of the barbette where the No. 4 turret once stood, to a rifle volley and the sound of taps. The last of them, Lauren Bruner, was placed into the ship in 2019. He had stood on Arizona's deck that morning in '41. He chose to stay with her forever.
That story is now told fairly often. Here is one almost nobody knows. Right next to Arizona lies another ship, Utah. She is almost never talked about, and there is a reason for that. By 1941, Utah was no longer a fighting battleship. Years earlier, her main guns had been removed, and she had been converted into a training and target ship. She was moored at the berth where aircraft carriers usually tied up. Japanese pilots had been ordered outright not to waste torpedoes on her. But someone in the morning confusion mistook her for a real battleship, and someone ignored the order. 2 torpedoes tore into her hull. Utah capsized in about 12 minutes, taking 58 men down inside her. And one of the men who stayed in the sinking hull stayed there by choice. Chief watertender Peter Tomich, an immigrant from the country that would later become Croatia, was on watch in a boiler room when the attack came. As Utah began to roll over, he did not run for the ladders. He stayed below to secure the boilers so they would not explode, and he held his post long enough for the men under him to get out. He did not get out himself. For this, Peter Tomich was awarded the Medal of Honor. And here is the bitter detail. There was no one to receive it. Tomich had no close relatives in America, and the medal sat unclaimed for decades, until finally, in 2006, his family was traced across the ocean, and the award was handed to them, 65 years later. Utah herself was an attempt to write the same way, with the cables and winches that would later work on another ship. Here it failed. The hull dragged along the bottom instead of rolling upright, and the effort was abandoned. Utah still lies on her side in the harbor today, a couple of 100 yards from the Arizona Memorial. There is a small monument on the shore, and that is all.
Only a fraction of the visitors who come to the ship next door ever reach her, though there are still men inside her hull too. And like Arizona, her survivors can ask to be returned to their shipmates after death. Now here is the story that truly stuns people, if you know all of it. Oklahoma capsized that morning, rolling completely upside down. She was hit by at least 5 torpedoes in a matter of minutes, and she went over so fast that hundreds of men were trapped inside, in total darkness, in compartments filling with water. 429 men died. But not all of them died at once. From the overturned hull, from under the water, came tapping. Men caught in air pockets were banging on the steel with anything they could find, hoping someone outside would hear. And outside, someone did. A civilian yard worker named Julio de Castro gathered a crew of fellow dockyard men. They pinpointed the tapping by ear, and they started cutting into the hull.
Air for the work was fed over from the ship alongside Tennessee. Every cut had to be careful. A spark or the wrong opening could release an air pocket, and then the water would rush up and drown the very men they were trying to reach. Over about 24 hours, De Castro's crew pulled 32 men out of the overturned battleship alive. For decades, that was where Oklahoma's story usually ended. The ship was raised nearly 2 years later, with enormous effort and dozens of winches, but she could never fight again. She was decommissioned, stripped of everything of value, and in 46, sold for scrap. In May of 47, 2 tugs began towing the bare hull toward a breaker's yard. About 540 miles out, a storm hit. Oklahoma began to list and dragged both tugs backward behind her. The crews had to cut their cables to save their own ships, and the battleship sank in the open ocean. Her exact position has never been found.
But Oklahoma has a second ending, and it came only recently. More than 400 of her dead could never be identified after the war. They were buried as unknowns under blank headstones in a cemetery in Hawaii, and there they lay for more than 70 years. In 2015, remains representing 388 men were raised and sent to a laboratory, where, using DNA taken from living relatives, they were identified one by one. By the early 20s, of nearly 400 unknowns, names had been returned to 361 of them. Families who, for 3 generations, had known only the words "missing in action," finally got their men back and could bury them at home, under their real names. So 3 of the ships from that morning, in a sense, never left these waters at all. But with the other 5, the story gets much stranger. Before we get to them, it is worth pausing on what America did with a harbor full of sunken battleships.
Because what happened at Pearl Harbor after the attack is, on its own, one of the most underrated feats of the whole war. The Japanese assumed that a battleship sunk in shallow water was out of the war for good. By every previous measure, it was. But the Americans refused to accept that. Early the following year, the command placed a naval constructor, Captain Homer Wallen, in charge of the shipyard's salvage division. And it was Wallen who directed the raising of the fleet from the bottom of its own harbor through all of 1942. Under him went the salvage crews, the divers, the engineers, the yard workers, and the work stretched on for years. Divers spent tens of thousands of hours underwater, in the dark, in oil and mud, patching holes by feel, pumping out one compartment after another. Ships lying on the bottom were raised, patched, brought into the nearest dock, and rebuilt almost from scratch. And it was not only a matter of repair.
Many of these battleships came back stronger than they had been before the attack. Their old superstructures cut down, new anti-aircraft guns added, and above all, the newest radar, which they had not had on the morning of 41. The same industrial power that would launch ships faster than the enemy could sink them showed its other face here. It could bring back to life what had already been counted as dead. The Japanese attack was meant to erase 8 battleships from the war. In the end, 6 of the 8 returned to it and fired on the enemy. Where exactly those 6 returned to, we are about to see. West Virginia took 2 bombs and at least 7 torpedoes and settled on the bottom right at her mooring, still upright on an even keel. 106 men died. But 2 things happened on her deck that morning that deserve to be told in full. The first, one of the men aboard was never supposed to be at a gun at all. Doris Miller served as a mess attendant, a steward in the officer's wardroom, one of the few roles the Navy allowed a black sailor to hold at the time. When the attack began, his own battle station was already wrecked. Miller was a big, strong man, the ship's boxing champion, and instead of taking cover, he began carrying wounded men to safety. Among those he carried out of the fire was the ship's mortally wounded commander, Captain Mervyn Benyon. And then Miller found a .50 caliber anti-aircraft gun with no one left to man it. He had never been trained on it. Black sailors were simply not allowed near the guns. He opened fire anyway and kept firing until the ammunition ran out and the order came to abandon ship. By the Navy's official count,
he brought down 1 plane, and by his own account, and that of other witnesses, 4 to 6. 6 months later, Doris Miller became the first black sailor in American history to receive the Navy Cross.
The award was pinned on him personally by Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet. A man who had not even been given the training the men beside him had, decorated for picking up a weapon and fighting for them. This story has an ending that gets recalled less often. In November of '43, the escort carrier Liscum Bay, where Miller was serving by then, was torpedoed by a Japanese submarine and went down in minutes. Doris Miller was lost with the ship. He was 24 years old. Many years later, the Navy would name an aircraft carrier after him, the first major warship named for a black enlisted sailor. The second story from West Virginia only came to light half a century later. When the ship settled to the bottom, 3 young sailors were trapped in a storeroom deep in the hull, compartment A-111. Their names were Ronald Endicott, 18, Clifford Olds, 20, and Lewis Costin, 21. Above them was water, around them was steel, and there was no way out. They did not die that day. When, weeks later, while raising the ship, salvage crews finally reached that compartment, they found 3 dead men inside, along with flashlight batteries, the remains of emergency water and rations, and a calendar. On it, days had been crossed off in red pencil, one after another, from the 7th to the 23rd of December. Those 3 lived 16 more days in a sealed steel box, hearing the work going on outside, unable to call out or break free. The Navy said nothing about it to their families for decades. Their relatives only learned the truth in '95 from a newspaper story. West Virginia herself was raised and rebuilt almost from the keel, fitted with the newest fire control radar of the day. She did not rejoin the war until the middle of '44. But she came back a better ship than the one that sank. And she came back, as we will soon see,
with a very specific purpose. California took on water slowly over several days as her damage control crews fought to keep her afloat. One of her machinist's mates, Robert Scott, stood at an air compressor that fed compressed air to the gun crews below decks, and without that air, the guns fell silent. When a torpedo flooded his compartment, the rest of the men left. Scott stayed. Witnesses reported his last words roughly like this: "This is my station, and as long as the guns are firing, I will keep giving them air." He never came out. 98 men died on California that morning, and Scott was one of 4 sailors from this one ship who received the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest award. California settled to the harbor floor anyway, was raised, rebuilt, and fitted with the same advanced radar as West Virginia. By January of '44, she was back in the war, and she later survived a kamikaze strike at Lingayen Gulf, losing dozens more men, but staying in the fight. 2 of the battleships that morning survived largely because of where they were standing. Tennessee lay inboard, closer to shore, behind West Virginia, and it was West Virginia's hull that shielded her from the torpedoes. Not one could reach her side. But when West Virginia went down, her wreckage pinned Tennessee against a mooring quay, trapping her in place. And from the burning Arizona, flaming oil drifted across the water straight toward her stern. Rather than fight to break free, her crew kept the propellers turning just enough to push the water astern and shove the burning oil away from the ship for hours, while also fighting the fires on West Virginia beside them. 2 bombs still hit Tennessee herself. A fragment from one of them flew to the neighboring bridge and killed the commander of West Virginia, that same Captain Benyon whom Doris Miller had carried. Tennessee was damaged, but quickly repaired and rebuilt with the new radar too.
Maryland lay inboard of Oklahoma, which meant Oklahoma took the torpedoes meant for her. Maryland was hit by 2 bombs, but she was never close to sinking, and her gunners were among the first in the whole harbor to fire back at the Japanese planes. 4 of her men died. Within weeks, she was back in service. She came off lighter than any ship on Battleship Row, and she still had a debt to collect. And now these ships stop being simply repair stories. On the night of the 25th of October, 1944, a Japanese force under Admiral Nishimura was steaming toward Leyte Gulf in the Philippines. The plan was desperate: to break through the narrow Surigao Strait in the dark and strike the American invasion fleet, putting troops ashore. Nishimura led 2 old battleships, Fuso and Yamashiro, a cruiser and 4 destroyers. He was going in nearly blind, knowing they were waiting for him, and he went in anyway. Blocking his path in the strait were 6 American battleships. 5 of the 6 had been sunk or crippled at Pearl Harbor less than 3 years before: West Virginia, California, Tennessee, Maryland, and Pennsylvania. The 6th was Mississippi, who had not been in the harbor that morning in 41. This was not just a squadron. These were the ghosts of Pearl Harbor, raised off the bottom and brought here to meet the man who had sunk them. First, the Japanese column was torn apart in the dark by American torpedo boats and destroyers. Torpedoes ripped through the formation, and Fuso took a hit that would later break her in 2, leaving both halves burning on the water. And then the battleships spoke. West Virginia, California, and Tennessee had that new radar, and that radar meant they found their targets in total darkness from more than 20 miles away, before the Japanese even understood they were seen. Maryland had no new radar, but her crews took their aim from the flashes of the other ship's guns and put 6 salvos of their own main battery into the Japanese line all the same. The American battleships had formed across the enemy's course, laying down the classic crossing of the T. Every one of their turrets could fire a full broadside, while the Japanese could answer only with the forward guns of their lead ship. West Virginia opened fire first and hit Yamashiro with her very first salvo, from a range of nearly 13 miles. California and Tennessee joined a moment later. The Japanese ships, with no radar, fired at the flashes into the dark, barely understanding where the steel raining down on them was coming from. Yamashiro went to the bottom under a hail of shells, taking Admiral Nishimura with her. He stayed on his bridge to the end. Of his entire force, essentially 1 destroyer survived. The action went into history as the Battle of Surigao Strait. It was the last time in history that battleships fought battleships directly, broadside to broadside. And the ships that closed the age of the battleship were the very ones that 3 years earlier had lain on the bottom of Pearl Harbor. West Virginia did not stop there. She supported the landings at Iwo Jima and Okinawa and shot down 8 kamikaze along the way, before one of them finally got through in April of 45 and struck her, killing 4 more of her crew. She kept fighting even after that. One of the 8 battleships did not simply survive a rebuild and return to service. This one refused to die twice. Nevada was the only battleship that managed to get underway that morning, while every other ship on Battleship Row took its hits sitting at anchor. Nevada's engineers raised steam and drove her toward the mouth of the harbor, toward open water. For anyone watching, it was an almost unthinkable sight. In the middle of a burning, sinking fleet, one battleship was moving ahead under her colors, firing back. Japanese pilots saw it and switched to her, trying to sink her right in the channel, to seal the harbor exit for every other ship. Bombs rained down on Nevada. At least 1 torpedo went in. Fires broke out. And then her crew made a hard choice. They deliberately ran her aground off Hospital Point, so she would not sink in the channel and block the way out for the whole fleet. 60 men died. Nevada was pulled off the mud, fully repaired, and sent back to war. And she fought it on a different ocean. On the 6th of June, 1944, Nevada stood off the coast of Normandy, the only Pearl Harbor battleship to reach D-Day. That morning, she fired 337 main battery shells and nearly 2,700 rounds from her secondary guns at the German batteries and strongpoints above Utah Beach, supporting the landing and the paratroopers of the 101st Airborne, who had dropped in the night. Then she returned to the Pacific and supported the landings at Iwo Jima and Okinawa. By the end of the war, she was one of the most decorated battleships in the entire American Navy. And then the Navy did to Nevada what Japan had not managed to. In '46, she was chosen as the primary target for Operation Crossroads, the first atomic tests at Bikini Atoll. The Navy gathered nearly 100 ships there, obsolete American, captured Japanese and German alike, and anchored them in a circle around the aim point, to see what an atomic bomb would do to a modern fleet. Nevada was placed at the very center and painted bright orange so the bomber crew could aim straight at her.
The first bomb, dropped from a superfortress, missed by nearly a mile and went off over a different ship. Nevada survived. Weeks later, the Navy detonated a second atomic bomb underwater, directly beneath the anchored fleet. Nevada survived that too. Damaged, contaminated, but still afloat. The Navy decided she was too radioactive and too old. In '48, Nevada was towed out to open sea off Hawaii, and the Navy tried to sink her on purpose. Cruisers shelled her for days on end. Aircraft dropped bomb after bomb on her, and Nevada would not go down, as if refusing to accept death at the hands of her own side. In the end, one single aerial torpedo did what 2 atomic bombs and days of gunfire could not. Nevada sank on the 31st of July, 1948. For decades, no one knew exactly where she lay. Only in 2020 did a survey team find the ship, overturned, at a depth of more than 15,000 feet, about 65 miles off Hawaii. The sailors who had served on Nevada used to call her too tough to die. The footage from the wreck proves they were not exaggerating. Nevada was not the only battleship the Navy sent to Bikini. Pennsylvania had come through Pearl Harbor almost untouched because she was sitting in dry dock during the attack. And she turned out to be perhaps the luckiest battleship of the entire war, right up until its very end. She served as flagship of the Pacific Fleet through half the war, the Aleutian Islands, landing after landing across the Pacific, and that same Surigao Strait, where the old Pearl Harbor battleships finished off the Japanese squadron. Of all 8, she came off the lightest, and she spent the longest of any of them at the very edge of the firing line. And then fate seemed to catch up with her.
On the 12th of August, 1945, when the war was already all but over, and Pennsylvania lay at anchor in Buckner Bay off Okinawa, a lone Japanese plane came in and drove a torpedo into her stern. 20 men were killed. It was the last torpedo hit on an American battleship in the whole war, just 2 days before it ended. The ship that had sat in dry dock in December of '41 and come out almost whole took her heaviest wound in August of '45, when there was almost no one left to kill. It was precisely this damage that led the Navy to decide against returning her to service, and to send her to Bikini instead. There, in the lagoon, Pennsylvania survived both blasts. But she came out of the second so radioactive that engineers could no longer safely work on her. She was towed to Kwajalein Atoll, studied from a distance for over a year, and then quietly scuttled in deep water there in February of '48. Think about that for a moment. Of the 8 Pearl Harbor battleships, 2 were ultimately destroyed by their own Navy's atomic tests. America's nuclear bombs killed more Pearl Harbor battleships than the Japanese attack that started the war. And that brings us to the ship almost everyone knows, the one that stands over all of it. But before she takes up her watch, there is one of her own warnings worth telling. Missouri never saw Pearl Harbor as a warship. She was not even launched until '44. She came to the war late, and near the very end, off Okinawa, she took a blow that defined her character. On the 11th of April, 1945, kamikaze came at her. Almost all were shot down, but one Japanese fighter, riddled with anti-aircraft fire, still slammed into her side. The 500-kilogram bomb beneath it did not explode. Only a small fire broke out, and the Americans lost not a single man. In the wreckage on deck, they found the pilot's body, or what was left of it. He was a boy of 19 named Setsuo Ishino, and Missouri's commander, Captain William Callahan, made a decision that outraged many in the crew: to bury the Japanese pilot the next day at sea, with full military honors. Sailors who only a day earlier had watched this man try to kill them on the captain's order sewed a makeshift Japanese flag from red and white cloth so the pilot could be lowered into the water under his own colors. The ship's chaplain read the service. The body, draped in that flag, was committed to the sea to a rifle volley. Some of the crew were against it to the last, but the captain explained it simply. Before them was a fellow warrior who had shown courage and given his life for his country, and he deserved to be buried as a warrior and not thrown overboard. A few months later, the whole war ended on Missouri's deck.
On the 2nd of September, 1945, in Tokyo Bay, Japanese representatives signed the Instrument of Surrender aboard her, with General Douglas MacArthur presiding. 23 minutes, and the deadliest war in human history was over. And Missouri was only beginning her long life. She went to war again in Korea, shelling the coast with her 16-inch guns. And then, almost half a century after that morning in Tokyo Bay, she went to war once more, in a different world, for a different generation. In '91, in the Persian Gulf, Missouri launched cruise missiles at targets in Iraq and fired her main battery at an enemy for the last time. With that, she became the last American battleship ever to fire her guns in anger, and, in effect, closed a whole era. The age of the battleship, which the ghosts of Pearl Harbor had sealed at Surigao, finally passed into history along with her. Missouri was retired from the fleet in '92, half a year after her last salvo.
And the question came up of what to do with her. Most retired battleships go to the scrappers or to some port nobody visits. That, in fact, is how nearly all the heroes of this story ended. West Virginia, California, Tennessee, and Maryland, who had fought the whole war and finished the Japanese fleet at Surigao, were quietly cut up for scrap in '59. Ships raised from the bottom and brought back from the dead survived the war, only to go under the torch in peacetime. Missouri could have ended the same way. Instead, in '98, she was handed to a memorial association and brought to Pearl Harbor. The National Park Service, which runs the Arizona Memorial, was firmly against it at first. Nearly 2 million people visit Arizona every year. It is a quiet, solemn place, a war grave. The fear was that a huge battleship, almost 900 feet long, set right beside it, would turn Pearl Harbor into a spectacle instead of a place of remembrance. In the end, a compromise was reached. Missouri would come, but she would stand well back so that people on her deck could not see Arizona during ceremonies. 2 separate places, deliberately kept apart. But one decision was made on purpose. Missouri's bow would face Arizona directly, not side on, not turned away, face to face, looking at her. The explanation was simple. Missouri stands watch over Arizona, so the men inside can rest. And here is what makes that more than a beautiful gesture, once you know the rest of the story. Let us bring it all together. 8 ships, 8 fates. 2 remained on the bottom of Pearl Harbor, Arizona and the former target ship Utah, with men still inside. 1, Oklahoma, rose from the bottom only to sink under tow in the open ocean, and lies out there somewhere, unfound. 2, Nevada and Pennsylvania, survived everything Japan could throw at them, and died to the atomic bombs of their own navy.
And 3 more, West Virginia, California, and Tennessee, together with Maryland, fought the whole war, took their revenge at Surigao, and in '59 were quietly cut into scrap. Of the 8 battleships from that morning, not one is afloat today, except one ship that was not even in the harbor that morning. 4 of the 8 had fought Japanese battleships in the last battleship duel in history, and only Arizona and Utah beside her still lie down there with their men inside. Missouri stands watch over more than one sunken ship. She is the only battleship still keeping vigil over what is left of an entire fleet that was there that morning. Arizona will never be moved. The hull is too fragile now, sunk too far into the harbor bed. To move it would be to destroy what is left, and to disturb the men who are still inside. Missouri is not going anywhere either.
She stands exactly where someone decided she should stand, facing the sunken ship. The start of the war and the ship that ended it, 400 yards apart, in the same water, for as long as anyone keeps coming to look. And if you have made it this far, write in the comments the name of the one you remember. Let it be said out loud, too.